Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for African News with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, South Africa's president is ordered to put money back into government coffers after being slammed for splurging tens of millions of public funds on just one of his private residences. The Ombudsman's decision about Jacob Zuma's exorbitant spending comes with elections just around the corner. Also, almost a year on since the Seleka rebel insurgency that triggered Central African Republic's current crisis, a trio of faith leaders head to the States to plead with the UN Security Council to do more and quickly. Our correspondents met with the group in Washington. And the violence in Central African republics created almost 1 million refugees and displaced peoples, while Doctors Without Borders, or MSF, is calling on the world not to turn a blind eye to the civilians caught in the middle of the warring. First up, South Africa's president has been ordered to pay back part of the $23 million of public money he used to refurbish one of his private homes. The country's public protector on Wednesday finally released a long-awaited report into what was, at the time, described as security upgrades to Jacob Zuma's home. However, the pricey renovations at the so-called ZUMAVILLE were more sumptuous than secure. He's been slammed for violating the code of ethics by his office by splurging on opulence on a grand scale. Julia Seeger has more.
This is the house that Zuma built, costing the South African state over $20 million. The president's sprawling homestead in the village of Nkandla in KwaZulu-Natal has been upgraded at taxpayers' expense with a security fence, a helipad, and houses for his 4 wives and countless relatives. It's in stark contrast to the neighbors who live in huts overlooking his residence.
It's disappointing, but we remain hopeful that our turn will come. We are hopeful. Maybe one day they will build us houses as well. He can see that we're suffering.
This scandal could cost President Zuma millions of votes in the country's upcoming election. It's shed light on South Africa's stark inequality, but it's also given opposition parties ample ammunition. Julius Malema, the leader of the opposition Economic Freedom Fighters Party, bought houses here for local residents to highlight Zuma's extravagance at the expense of the poor. Many neighbors already say they'll be backing Malema. Analysts also expect many other voters across the country to desert the ANC.
This Nkandla, the house, the 208 million rand spent on it, symbolizes everything that people have a discomfort with the current administration.
President Zuma's popularity is at an all-time low. The ANC, however, is still set to win the election as the party that liberated the country from white minority rule.
Well, for more on this, France 24's Aisha Ishmael joins us now from Cape Town. Aisha, so the public protector has found that Jacob Zuma violated the ethics of his office, but that he did so accidentally, so he's not criminally liable for anything. But the opposition Democratic Alliance says that they will be trying to get him impeached. Is there much mileage likely to be in that?
Well, having the president impeached is unprecedented in South Africa. But yes, the Democratic Alliance, the official opposition party in South Africa, have said that they're going to be initiating impeachment charges against the president. They want Parliament to impeach him. But they're also saying that cabinet ministers who have been implicated in this 245 million rand upgrade to the president's private home, they're saying that punitive action must also be taken against these cabinet ministers. Now, it must be noted that President Jacob Zuma has 3 private residences in South Africa, all paid by the South African taxpayer. And people in South Africa are very angry about this. Some people, soon after the Public Protector's report was released today, took to Twitter to give their response to the Public Protector's response. People were saying, impeach Zuma immediately, saying enough is enough. They're also saying that President Jacob Zuma is an insult to the people of South Africa, to the millions of poor people and unemployed people in South Africa. They're saying it's a disgrace that he had to pay 200 million rand to upgrade his private residence.
Now, Aisha, with elections around the corner, this comes at a particularly bad time for Zuma and the ANC, because he wasn't the only one singled out for criticism by the public protector, was he?
No, he wasn't. There were other cabinet ministers also singled out, including the Minister of Public Works, who had to sign off on a lot of on the bulk of the expenditure used under the guise of security, upgrade security for President Jacob Zuma. In the Public Protector's report, she also pointed out that President Jacob Zuma improperly benefited from the so-called security upgrades. And she also said that Zuma's immediate family improperly benefited from this. She also calls the expenses excessive. And so, as I said earlier, thousands of people in South Africa are very upset about this. And they say there are so many poor people, unemployed people, jobless people in South Africa who probably feel insulted by the fact that so much money had to be spent on the upgrades on Jacob Zuma's private residence.
Aisha Ishmael there for us. Thanks very much joining us from Cape Town. Well, meanwhile, in Zimbabwe, the government's responded to public outrage over fat cat salaries by slashing the pay and perks of managers of state-owned firms. President Mugabe had faced mounting pressure over revelations that many executives were being paid over 350,000 euros a month in a country where the average wage is around 260 euros a month. Well, on Wednesday, Finance Minister Patrick Chinamasa said public bosses will now earn up to a maximum of around 51,000 euros a month, including benefits. However, Zimbabwe is seen as one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and there fears that the huge pay cut could see top managers topping up their take-home with graft. Now, a day before the two warring sides in South Sudan's crisis are due to restart stalled peace negotiations, and Western diplomats are concerned that not everyone may turn up. In a joint statement, the US, the UK, Norway and the EU on Wednesday warned both President Salva Kiir's government and the camp of former Vice President Riek Machar that efforts to undermine the peace process could result in sanctions. Now, the threat of civil war arose after fighting between government troops and those loyal to Machar began last December. Thousands have been killed since, and there fears that with the rainy season around the corner, the hundreds of thousands stuck in refugee camps face risk of waterborne diseases. Meanwhile, France continues to grapple to get more EU troops to Central African Republic. There's a real fear that fighting that began almost a year ago could turn into the forgotten conflict. Three religious leaders from different faiths in the former French colony pleaded before the UN in New York this week, asking for peacekeepers to be sent to help stop what they called a genocidal war. Well, our correspondent, Philip Crowther, met the trio as they later headed to the US Capitol.
They came here together from a divided Central African Republic. They, the Archbishop, the Reverend, and the Imam eat their meals together here, while back home sectarian violence is rife. They come to Washington after pleading for help from the UN Security Council in New York. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon recommends a peacekeeping mission of 12,000 members. They've come to tell their tales at the White House, at the State Department, at think tanks, to anyone who will listen.
A Christian doesn't kill. Thou shalt not kill. That's what it says in the Bible. Walking through blood to get to power, we reject that.
To see us together like this in the country they call the most powerful in the world, we think that the people of the Central African Republic will find hope. The hope that we are not alone, that we haven't been abandoned, and that hope is allowed.
We're looking for this type of democracy. We're here to get inspiration.
These three men know each other well.
Here is the White House.
Since it began a year ago, they've tried to make sure the crisis is not forgotten. Their meeting at the White House is with Barack Obama's advisors. They want more interest and more support.
We have to go on a journey like this one all the way to the White House because the United States is one of the powerful countries in the world, and it cannot remain indifferent when faced with suffering like this of our people.
Bye-bye.
Despite the atrocities witnessed by the Imam, the Reverend and the Archbishop, there is time for a few smiles. Everything is working out nicely, they say.
Okay, excellent.
They now take their optimism and their pleas for help to Europe. They say they will take anything to save the Central African Republic.
Well, for more on the crisis in Central African Republic, we're joined now by Michael Newman from Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. Michael, thanks very much for coming in. Now, Médecins Sans Frontières is one of the NGOs acting on the ground, and many of you feel very much abandoned by a lack of political will to actually tackle the crisis that you're dealing with day to day.
Right, it's been the case for Central African Republic for the past few years now. We've alerted on the fate of that abundant country in disarray in 2011 with very little results, unfortunately. We have now massive operations, but beside massive operations and scaling up by NGOs, including MSF, of course, we see little political will of the humanitarian community, of the world community. The Central African Republic government himself says little about the fate of the population, the thousands of the people that are displaced in the bush, those who are staying in the camps in Bangui, or those with the worst fate today, which are the Muslims staying in the enclaves under the threat of the militias, just poorly protected by international forces. And this is probably the most precarious population today.
So whilst we're talking about all the efforts going on the international and political stage to try and get more boots on the ground, what you're saying is that from what you've seen, there's been no trickle-down effect on the challenges that you deal with day to day.
I mean, there's been some level of decrease of insecurity in Bangui compared to what we've seen in December and January, of course. But the massive exodus that we've seen of the Muslim population happening in January and February is still a dynamic. Population are still stuck in places like Bossangoa, in Bouar, in Carnot, thousands of people that have absolutely no future, and that we see very little hope offered to them, very little support, and no political declaration, no nothing, no declaration really, no statement.
Well, thanks very much for coming in to speak to us, Michael Newman there from MSF, Doctors Without Borders. Fortunately, that's all we have time for today for African News. I will be back, though, with more in about 45 minutes. Join us then if you can.